stopped here. We were going over varicose veins. I don't remember if there was a picture, so I added this. Basically, varicose veins are those veins that you can see at the surface. Something has happened. If we go back to those valves that we know are in veins, this valve can become leaky either through a congenital defect, and so you're born or genetically predisposed to leaky valves, or there's some evidence to show mechanical stress as well. And so when you're pregnant, especially if you're pregnant with twins or triplets, there's a lot of blood pressure issues. Obviously, right, the blood has to go to the baby, the placenta, back to the mom. And so you find fluid buildup in various areas, and that can sometimes cause varicose veins. Or you notice a lot of people that are on their feet quite a bit, nurses, people that work cashiers, grocery stores their whole lives, factory workers, people that are on their feet constantly their whole lives also tend to develop these varicose veins. So there are multiple reasons for it. Not the same thing as spider veins, those kind of superficial purpley veins we get as we age. Both can be fixed. Sometimes compression stockings help with this to help with that venous return and things like that. And so varicose veins is usually a vocab word on the test. Just something has occurred to that valve, so you have a excess fluid buildup inside of that. I told you that usually you think, how does the blood get back to the heart? You may consider that was probably the heart itself, and that's true. You know, it does allow for, if I go to this picture, the heart pumping does provide that pressure from the arteries. And so just mechanically, the fluid being pressed through the capillaries up to the veins, that does help. But you have air pressure, you have gravity you have to work against. So really, what's changing the pressure to allow the blood to flow back is your respiratory system, changing the pressure in the lungs and the thoracic cavity itself, and your skeletal muscles. So the two main ways that blood returns to the heart are action of your skeletal muscles, moving your body in some way, along with the valves and the veins, and your lungs. So your skeletal muscle pump and your respiratory pump. Here's an image of veins, and we'll have to learn several of these. For lecture, I won't test you over any, give me a second. There we go. I'm muting all of you. I can hear myself echoing back from somebody. There we go. Anyway, take a look at this. Begin to use this and the lab manual to help you figure out which veins you will have to know for lab. On lecture, I won't have pictures of veins, and so I won't necessarily ask you to recall any, except for maybe some main ones. I'd like you to know brachio means arm, femoral means leg, tibial or femoral thigh, tibial leg, things like that, things we've discussed. Eventually, we're going to learn the major branches, so the inferior vena cava going up this way, superior vena cava going back to the heart this way, the coronary sinus, notice it's bolded, that has to dump back to the right atria. Blood from this portion of the body pooling this way, blood from this portion pooling this way, from the head down. Notice it all joins the superior vena cava. Blood from this leg and all the tissues this direction. And the liver is its own system, dumps back to the inferior vena cava to dump into the heart, of course. Why would the liver be its own system? Well, if we look back at the arteries, a lot of your major capillary beds are here around the liver, around the large intestine, small intestine, spleen, stomach. That blood is picking up anything from those tissues, things you eat. We kind of use the generic word toxins. What does that mean? Bad stuff, fats, anything like that you're picking up. Fats are being dumped to your lymph system, but anything that's being picked up from that GI system you don't want to go straight back to the heart. What if there's stuff you can filter out? So what you do is those capillary beds dump into the liver first. Then that dumps to the inferior vena cava. Now the liver is a tissue itself, so it has to also be fed oxygen, and then it also dumps to the inferior vena cava. But that's called a portal system, an alternate pathway to make sure your blood from the stuff that you eat, the stuff that you break down, the stuff that you break down in your spleen, etc., gets filtered before it goes to the heart. So anyway, I studied from this type of picture. I basically took this image and I whited out everything until I could label all of it. There's some in this class we don't learn. We don't learn the ones in the feet. We don't learn the ones in the hand necessarily, but all the major ones we definitely do, or at least talk about. And so your capillaries are the functional unit of the circulatory system, but your veins are sometimes referred to as reservoirs or capacitance vessels, because really after the oxygen has been dumped out and you pick up the wastes, that blood is being held in your venous system. It's not necessarily functionally active. It's not necessarily carrying white blood cells to tissues or anything like that. I mean, it can, but it's more just holding it until it gets back to the heart. And so we call it a reservoir, just like a water tower reservoir in a city or something. And so the veins of skin and all of that function as blood reservoir. And if you need it, you can shunt it elsewhere. And so during times of inflammation or wounds, things like that, you can close off some of those capillaries and shunt your blood down those veins into other areas. I'll give you this picture, but you don't necessarily have to know these percentages. That's just to give you a visual, right? And so systemic veins, notice 60% of most blood is in your veins at any one time. Look how little is actually in the heart at any one time. Because really the heart is just the pumping mechanism, just making sure it gets to the lungs and then gets to the bodies. And the capillaries, they're only one cell thick in some cases. And so you can't hold very much there, and so most of it is held in the veins. I don't think I ever ask percent. Why would you need to know that, right? If you ever did need to recall it, maybe you're going into paramedic or something and not nursing, just know that more than 50% is in your veins. And that would be good enough. I can't recall a reason you would need to know for fundamentals of nursing, but maybe just know that most of it's in your veins and you'll be good. Held in your veins at any one time. Now it's constantly being pumped, so I need to be careful with my phrasing there. It's hard when I can't see you. Here I am, and so just make sure that if I do ask a question, I wouldn't have you pick out percentages. Just know that most is in the veins. All right, move on, Corey. This stressed me out to no end when I first learned it. And then after I had to take it again in my second semester of nursing, maybe, and it made more sense. And then by the time I taught it, I was, oh, it makes so much sense if I just would have thought about it. And so what you have here is cartoon diagrams of major capillary beds in the thorax and the abdomen. So it's showing you major areas of capillary exchange, gas exchange. We see our heart here. We see our aorta, your thoracic abdominal descending aorta. Blood is delivered then to stomach. Well, this is liver, sorry. Liver, stomach, spleen, as well as upper portions of your large intestine and pancreas and your lower intestines. I said large, I meant to say upper intestines and lower intestines. He or this cartoon may be referring to this as lower body. I can't tell, but regardless, what we want to look at is right here. The major areas from the liver itself, that one, the outside of it has to receive its own tissues, just like the outside of the heart has to receive its own blood. What you do, the blood that goes to the stomach, gastric, and splenic areas where you're filtering, you don't want to send that straight up to the heart. You want to filter it first. So blood enters the liver from two sources. Obviously, it has its own artery to make sure it stays alive, called the hepatic artery. So that's making sure that all the tissues of the liver are perfused with oxygen, it's staying alive. But down here, all of the return, the stuff where you might pick up bad stuff, nutrients, medicines in some cases, toxins, wastes, go through the liver first to filter and then to the inferior vena cava back to the heart. And so this alternate pathway is called a portal vein. You're passing it through something else first, then back to the heart. And there are a couple places in your body that do that. But for some reason, hepatic portal circulation, I was like, what does that word mean? I don't have time to study this. I moved on. We had a lot of stuff going on. It confused me. But just think areas where you eat something or break blood down, or any area that you might pick up toxins, wastes, medicines, you're sending that to the liver first before it goes back to the heart. And so that's why your liver is considered your filtration system, which the kidneys also, yes, are your filter, but your liver kind of filters out those toxins, right? We don't cover liver physiology in here. You get that the very last semester or very last week, I think, in physiology. But with that hepatic means liver. The hepatic portal vein makes sure those get filtered. That's important for nurses to know because some medications are metabolized in the liver. They have to go to the liver first. I really want to look up another picture that I know is not in here and show you. We'll talk about it later if I have time, maybe on Monday. But to show you how the blood is filtered from the liver, certain medications go through the liver first. And so you need to know that because the amount of medication that you give by mouth may be higher than what the body actually needs because you know the liver is going to break most of it down. Or some medications can damage the liver, like too much Tylenol, or some substances like alcohol cause oxygen to not be delivered to certain areas of the liver. You make toxic byproducts that cause parts of the liver to die. And so anyway, that's getting into more physiology than we need right now. Hepatic artery delivers obviously to the whole liver. The portal vein is taking venous blood from these major areas of the stomach and the spleen to the liver first, then to the heart for filtration. So here's a cadaveric specimen. Let's see, what do we look at? We're going to learn the splenic artery in lab. We'll learn the celiac artery in lab. We learn superior mesenteric, it's been cut. We learn inferior mesenteric. Here you can see the iliac arteries branching off. See the renal arteries going to the kidney here. And so the common hepatic is right here that's going to feed the liver. And so, not that I'll ever make you identify anything with a cadaver, but it's just interesting to see how those branch off the aorta and then how that blood will be delivered. This will be the inferior vena cava. The liver has been dissected. It would have been here. But blood from those areas would go back to the liver first, then back to the inferior vena cava. I like this picture. Sometimes cartoons are easier to see. Here you have the liver, gallbladder. Here's the spleen, stomach. So all the arterial blood from here, and even some from here, the upper mesentery area, superior mesenteric, filters back to the hepatic portal vein first before it goes to the inferior vena cava. And so if we want to be specific, I won't make you learn the names of the veins for this test, but which organs deliver blood to the liver first before it goes to the heart? Venous blood. Intestines, spleen, pancreas, stomach. So this would be the superior mesenteric vein, the splenic vein. Pancreas would come from pancreatic as well as superior mesenteric, and stomach would be the gastric vein. And so basically you're detouring venous blood from the GI tract before it goes back. Part of this is just to modify some nutrients. Some of it is to break down toxins. Take a look at it. Let me know if you need help with that again. I think I already have part of this on YouTube channel. If you hate me or mine is kind of poor quality, just Google hepatic portal system circulation or YouTube it and multiple people have this drawn out, directed. We don't make you learn much more than just those areas deliver venous blood to the liver first. That's about it. I would like you to understand the why. So think about why you'd want that type of blood to be filtered first before going to the heart. And so really, I'm just hounding this, aren't I? Over and over again. The liver itself is an organ, so you have to give it arterial supply. And so it has its own hepatic artery that brings blood to the outside and all of those tissues, as well as venous blood from the inside gets filtered through these three filtration methods. And maybe if I can remember, I will add that to this PowerPoint, or we'll talk about it Monday, what that looks like. It's my special interest right now. I keep thinking about the liver, and you don't actually get much from it until into physiology, but I'd like to show you what the inside looks like. Here I'm going again, aren't I? I must really want you to know this. So the celiac artery is just a major branch here. We learned that in lab, and the celiac branches into hepatic, gastric, splenic. And so we'll learn all three. And there are smaller ones, like the hepatic actually branches into two, splenic, gastric branches into two. But for the major ones, celiac, gastric, hepatic, splenic, we learn those. We ID those in lab. And then the hepatic portal vein forms from the inferior mesenteric and the splenic vein, merging with the superior splenic, or superior mesenteric. So basically, this one, and this one all send blood here. Your GI tract, basically, your intestines, your spleen, your stomach, back to the liver. Do you see this? I'm doing it again. One more time. I must really, really, really want you to know this. Liver metabolism. Abdominal aorta, hepatic artery to feed the liver itself, but where is blood coming from? Smaller portions we call tributaries. We don't make you learn the small ones. Inferior mesenteric joins with the splenic, superior mesenteric joins, it all forms a large hepatic portal vein. That blood gets filtered, and you send that back to the heart. Sometimes it's taking out toxins, sometimes it's modifying. You can take two excess sugars. So say, what's average sugar? Help me out. 80 to 120 milligrams in your blood per deciliter. Too much, your body releases insulin, says, hey, bring it inside of the cells. You have too much in your blood, your brain is fine, you've eaten way too much sugar, we got to store it. You'll take it, and you'll put it to the liver, and the liver will store it as glycogen. And then if you don't eat throughout the day, or we don't have to eat constantly, because you can break glycogen down back into glucose to use it again. And so it doesn't have to be filtering out toxins. Sometimes it could just be modifying nutrients as well. You know that. All right, here's what the reason I didn't just cancel class today. People panic about fetal circulation, but you have to remember what we learned in the reproductive chapter. One, blood does not mix between mother's placenta and the baby. You bring oxygen to the tissues, to the villi that reach out, and then gas is exchanged and nutrients are exchanged into those cells and then into the arteries and veins of the fetus. But it's not like the mom's arteries grow into the body of the fetus. That doesn't make sense with human physiology. And so you need to remember that blood is traveling to the placenta from the fetus, from two umbilical arteries, and then blood is being delivered from one umbilical vein. And so the fetus is handling or is receiving oxygen, and wastes are being processed by the maternal organs. So there are capillary beds between the fetus and uterus that allow that exchange. But inside the fetus, if the mom is doing all the filtration, if the mom is the one that's breathing, if the mom is the one that's breaking down things, then you really just need to make sure the tissues inside the fetus don't die. You don't have to send blood to be filtered by the liver. Your liver may not even be grown yet. If it's, early on, first couple of months, you're obviously not breathing atmospheric oxygen. So you only have to make sure the outside of the lungs, or I shouldn't say outside, the lung tissues aren't dying. They have oxygen. You don't have to bring blood from the heart into those. And so there are a lot of areas in the fetus where you have bypasses, holes, extra vessels that we don't have as adults to make sure oxygenated blood, or sometimes just mixed blood, gets delivered to tissues. And so looking at this picture, here's the placenta. Blood travels from the fetus to placenta via two umbilical arteries, which are wrapped around the umbilical cord. Two arteries. And so those umbilical arteries carry blood to the placenta to pick up oxygen. And then arteries are carrying blood away from the fetal heart. There's one umbilical vein in that cord, returning blood to the fetus. Now, when you are an adult, you don't need that anymore, right? So behind your belly button, behind the umbilicus, that vessel fuses and eventually just becomes a ligament, the ligamentum teres. And so the rounded ligament. That's too much. Anyway, we'll talk about that anyway. This vessel that was delivering blood from the placenta, this is the umbilicus, into the fetus. Again, I'll say it one more time, you don't need it as an adult. And so that fuses and forms the ligamentum teres in an adult, because eventually your own heart will take over. But from right now, here's the fetus. So imagine the mom's side would be here. Here will be the placenta, oxygen being delivered from the mother. It is then delivered to the fetus into the vein. If we go back, the blood that needed to receive more oxygen had to be delivered out of the fetus down the arteries. Those arteries are wrapped around, deliver the carbon dioxide filled, waste filled blood to the placenta, dump those off. Then this vein picks up oxygen. My neighbor just started mowing their yard, so I'm sorry if you can hear that. That's where students get confused, because again, we're stuck with artery away, artery must be carrying oxygenated blood, veins carrying deoxygenated blood, which is true in an adult. That is true. But when you're a baby, a fetus, before your organs can even develop, you're not getting oxygen here. Your liver's not handling the filtration that hasn't even grown yet. And so remember, artery and vein doesn't necessarily mean oxygen and deoxygenated, but learn the pathway. So let's imagine you are trying to get high oxygen blood. Let's start here. Here's the mother's side, here's the placenta. That oxygen is delivered through the tissues, it diffuses, picked up by the vein of the umbilical cord. That is traveled this direction. Where do you take that blood first? Up this ligament, the umbilical vein, not a ligament yet, umbilical vein. And then here, does it have to go to the heart to get pumped? No, you're trying to get it everywhere. So it travels down the hepatic portal vein, it travels to the liver itself, it goes up this ductus venosus, which is a duct saying, hey, we just gotta get it straight to the liver. Then that gets to the heart, and the heart is pumping at this point. It's saying, great, get blood everywhere as fast as we can. So it's actually mixing with low oxygen and high oxygen blood, just saying it doesn't matter. We're not trying to get it to the lungs, we're trying to get it everywhere. So it bypasses the lungs in some cases, it goes across. You have a hole between the aorta or the atria where blood can just get quickly from the right atria to left atria. It goes to the head, goes to the lungs. It's passing through several channels. And if we go over here, with adult circulation, which you should already know at this point, you don't need. So here, this duct that we allowed blood to bypass and go right to the aorta, we don't need that as an adult. So that becomes a ligament. Down here, the hole in between the atria, we don't need that as an adult. We have to make sure blood gets to the lungs, then back to the atria. So we close that hole up. The umbilical vein that we used to use for blood to get from our placenta, We don't have a need that as an adult. So that fuses and becomes a ligament. Same thing here. The blood that was brought back from the kidneys, from the lower body, from all of that back to the arteries of the placenta, of the umbilical cord. We don't need those as an adult. And so they become umbilical arteries, arteries here that help give attachment for the bladder and for the reproductive organs. So luckily, we go over that step by step. It is the hardest thing to learn, I think, in this chapter because you're used to adult circulation, but not fetal. And so, do you have to know one, two, three, four, five of those terms and what they become? Yeah, but you've learned five things. Just understand that blood isn't going to these major organs for them to necessarily filter or get oxygen. It's to go to them to make sure they're alive. The mother is handling the filtration and the oxygenation. And so the umbilical vein branches, we talked about it here, to send blood this direction to bypass parts of the liver. It's called the ductus venosus. Goes to the inferior vena cava, which is going to dump into the right atria. In an adult, it becomes a ligament, ligamentum venosum, the ligament vein. You don't need that, right, as an adult. Showing you one more time, if we travel blood up this direction, that ductus venosus goes to the inferior vena cava, which goes to the right atria, which mixes with deoxygenated blood to get to all of these tissues. And so the right atria actually receives the most oxygen. Because at this point, it's mixing with a bunch of deoxygenated blood. It's still enough. It's still enough for the baby or the, who knows what age we are at this point, the fetus. But we're trying to get blood not just down to the right ventricle, but also as quickly to as many other places as we can. So it can go across to the left atria, it can go down to the ventricle and up to the pulmonary arteries, it can go up to the aorta. And so blood flows from right atria to right ventricle to the pulmonary arteries. Got to make sure these lungs are getting plenty of oxygen so they can grow because they're obviously not breathing. You're inside of all of that amniotic fluid. Most blood flows through a duct in the aorta called the ductus arteriosum. So if it goes here up, you can see that it has a little hole or a tube here to go from the pulmonary arteries to the aorta itself, as well as from the right ventricle to the aorta. So it's receiving a lot of blood there because you're kind of bypassing the lungs. You need to make sure that this tissue stays alive and is growing, but you're not dumping blood into those vessels at such a high rate to make sure that oxygen is occurring because you're not breathing. Right? As mammals, when we're babies growing inside of a placenta, we don't breathe atmospheric oxygen. It's only after birth, which is interesting. We have to receive that first breath of oxygenated air to get our lungs going. It's one of the most inefficient things about us, right? Our lungs has to receive atmospheric oxygen. We grow up or we grow inside of a bag of water. We live on a planet mostly made of water. Our air is filled with water vapor, but we have to breathe dry atmospheric air anyway. Our ductus arteriosum here, that as an adult, you don't want that there. And so that's going to fuse. It's sort of a place for the aorta to attach. And so it's called the ligamentum arteriosum in an adult. 6 weeks after birth, that fuses. So that it takes some time after you're breathing, but eventually that will fuse completely. And blood will efficiently go to lungs, then back to left atria, left ventricle, aorta. While this is happening, the hole here that allowed some blood to seep from right atria to left atria, that's going to eventually fuse. If it's open when you're growing, that's called a foramen ovale, an oval hole. But when that fuses in an adult, we call it a fossa ovalis because you don't want blood to go from right atria to left atria. You want it to go from right atria to left ventricle to lungs, then left atria, left ventricle aorta. So that hole has to fuse as well. And in some children, it doesn't. And so you have to sometimes have surgery on the heart, which is some rough go at it. It can be congenital. There are certain things that cause it. Smoking or being around secondhand smoke while you're pregnant causes certain genetic defects. Cleft palates, holes in hearts, deformed organs. Increased blood pressure. Anyway. So that foramen ovale fuses. Here's an older picture, but it's trying to show you that that hole in between the right atrium, left atrium is going to fuse. It's just a valve in between the atria, directing blood to make sure it's getting to more locations. Again, you don't need that as an adult, so that hole would close up. So this picture, these green bullet points, I should have put some down here on the arteries, but the vein, the ductus venosum, inferior vena cava, practice going through fetal blood supply. Understand why you'd bypass the liver, why you'd bypass lungs, why you would go from atria to atria, and then why you would not as an adult. Why do those areas close up? Well, it's to make sure that our proper circulation is there. So just spend some time with it. It is probably the hardest thing to go over, especially if at this point you haven't learned how blood flows through the heart, which should be old news, but you know how it goes. So just make sure you know that first, then spend some time with the fetal circulation. Because from the aorta, then your blood is going, I lost my mouse, it went to my other screen. From the aorta, blood goes to the internal iliac artery, umbilical arteries, etc., to all these tissues, and then back to the placenta. Now, again, these umbilical arteries you wouldn't need as an adult, and so they fuse and become the lateral umbilical ligaments. They give a location for the bladder to be attached as well as the reproductive organs. Sometimes you can still feel that. And so if you had to have your belly button prepped for a surgery or cleaned or something, sometimes you can feel that weird feeling that's pulling on those ligaments. The umbilical arteries become the lateral umbilical ligaments. Because you don't need blood to go back to the placenta, there's no placenta there. I liked images like this. It made it kind of simple for me to look at. If we start and look at placenta, blood goes up to the umbilical vein. Yes, the liver's getting tissue, but it's going through the ductus venosus because you're trying to get it to all the tissues as fast as possible. It goes up to the right atrium and right ventricle, as well as across to the left atrium. The right ventricle sends it to the lungs. That brings it back. The left atrium is sending as much blood as it can over to the left ventricle to go to the aorta. But you can also get straight from the pulmonary trunk back to the aorta as well through that ductus arteriosus. So there's a spot where basically, instead of making it go from atria, ventricle, lung, atria, ventricle, body, like in an adult, you do that, but you also send blood straight from atria to left atrium and straight from lungs to aorta. So the heart is receiving its normal blood flow that you find in an adult, plus, hey, let's get it to more places as fast as possible. So then you go back, and yes, blood is going to liver, but you're also bypassing some areas and making sure that there we go, bypassing those livers as well. Anyway, I like this image. Write it out over and over. Write it out in enough in practice. If you can say it out loud, you know it well enough for the test. If you don't know adult circulation, this is going to be very confusing for you at this point. So practice that. But understand you're bypassing lungs, bypassing liver, bypassing the proper circulation of the heart, because the goal when you are a growing fetus is to get oxygen to as many places as possible, as fast as possible, and then back to the placenta. And we are a mammal, so our first breath, assuming we have surfactant, assuming our lungs are developed enough, we have to have this slippery material that allows us to receive gaseous exchange. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how much oxygen you put to the lungs, they can't filter. So there's a certain age you have to be for your lungs to be able to take over. But that first breath results in reduced pressure. You're changing the pressure in that thoracic cavity and on that right side of the heart. And so immediately the fetal lungs take over. You begin to see closure of some of those openings, so closure of the fossa ovalis. Blood pressure falls in the inferior vena cava when that placental circulation stops, and then the decrease in oxygen begins to cause those arteries, veins,